Hey, and we are live. Good evening. Welcome to the podcast. So today I'm joined by Jorge Muñiz and John Santori, some of the members of the debate committee. And I'm super happy to have them on because we're going to talk about how the debate came together and how we really had very little time to prepare. And these guys on the team, I'm super proud to have worked with every one of them. Great group of people who love the neighborhood, who care about the neighborhood, who care about this district, and got together, spearheaded by Jorge, and we got it done. When Jorge sent out that email originally, I was like, wow, it's like a little bit under 4 weeks, and I thought it was kind of ambitious, and at times I'm like, can we really pull it off? And we did. So Jorge, thank you very much. John, thank you for all your help. We're gonna have
for sure.
other members of the debate committee joining us. We're also going to bring on Jeremy Kaplan. Let's bring him on right now.
Oh,
Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how are you?
We're live now.
We're good. So, Jorge, tell us about how this came about. Like, what motivated you to want to organize this debate?
Yeah, I think, like you said, Rob, it was a big team effort. And I for a long time have been following this race. State Assembly is an important position that we've had unchanged for a quarter of a century. And this year, unlike any other year, Sunset Park had a competitive election. And this is only the second time, I think, in other than 2014, that there's been a real option on the table. And this time we had three options on the table. And Marcela Mataines, Genesis Aquino, Katie Walsh, all three women that have resumes, right, that needed to be evaluated. And this year, with the pandemic, with just all the craziness, really, it's only really been in these last few weeks that we've been able to do debates. And I'm glad that, in addition with Uprose's debate, this was something that was able to happen in like an otherwise like really crazy time. But the idea to do a conversation like this, I think, has been something that I've been thinking about a lot, just because of how unique this year has been, I think.
Oh, it's I think it's probably, and we hear this a lot, right? Everyone, whenever there's an election, they're like, this is the most important election ever. And this is an important election. And I think this time around, it really is a very important election. I think what we're all seeing, what we're all living through is without a doubt historical, right? The pandemic, these are the kind of things that I, as a kid in school, read about, that flew in 1918, right? This is like that. And then on top of that, everything we see with inequality and police brutality and ICE and raids and racism from the president, right? So it's a scary time, without a doubt, and it's definitely a historical time. So this is definitely not a cliche when we use it in this instance, where this is perhaps one of the most important races, because everything at the local level probably has more of an impact on us here in this district. So, I'm excited about the election. The three women that are challenging the incumbent are very capable women, are candidates that I personally like them all because they really truly care about the neighborhood, about the district, and it's a tough choice, right? I think they all bring a lot to the table, and I think they have a lot to offer as candidates and have a lot to offer as assembly members if one of them were to make it. So I want to now have John chime in. Now, John, you write a blog about Sunset Park. Specific. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I was a reporter for a few years, and when I was a reporter, I started to cover CB7, which includes Sunset Park. And I stopped being a reporter in February of 2017, but I wanted to keep following neighborhood issues, specifically waterfront issues, That's been the area that I focused on the most. And I started by just focusing on Industry City and the Industry City rezoning conversation. And then I've sort of expanded out into other waterfront properties and other projects that are going on in the area. And periodically I've been taking on other issues as well. But I just go, I mean, it's slow going, but I just try to learn about things. I follow media coverage. I file freedom of information law requests to get more information. And I'm just trying to understand what's going on the waterfront so that I can join with other residents to advocate for specific development proposals or specific just proposals in general for the area.
How long have you been living in Sunset Park?
I came to the neighborhood in July of 2016, and I grew up in the Bronx. But I think I told you, Rob, when we chatted the other day, I had never been to the neighborhood before 2016.
Had you ever heard of Sunset Park before?
I don't think so. No. It was new to me. The whole area was new to me. Even though, I mean, you get on the D train goes to the A train. The A train goes close to where I grew up in the Bronx. So now I use that method to go see my parents. But I don't think I had ever heard of Sunset Park before.
So what did you like about the neighborhood that you're like, you know what? I'm from the Bronx, but this neighborhood seems kind of cool. Let me stay here for a while. Let me plant some roots.
The obviously it's obvious, but the park is so beautiful and the view was stunning. The first time I walked up the hill, it was before a CB7 meeting. I was on my way to cover a CB7 meeting. I had a few minutes. I walked up the hill, and I was really blown away by how remarkable the view is. And then I just really enjoy what a communal environment you go. Everywhere you go, you have all of these local businesses, local restaurants. People have, they're celebrating their respective cultures. There are so many different cultures in the neighborhood. And it's just a really friendly, nice place to be. So I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. And let's talk to Jeremy. Jeremy, you're a filmmaker, local filmmaker. You work on a lot of documentaries. Tell us a little bit about that work and why you wanted to be part of this debate committee.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it as a documentary filmmaker is talking about stories and narratives. And I think what was so interesting about holding this debate was that, as we've been saying, this is such an important election. And at the same time, it's also an election that a lot of people didn't know about. And I think there's not a lot of information about it. And that was kind of frustrating. I feel like part of the reason why it was so important to host a debate was to put some spotlight on the issues for the debate, and that this was a really important debate. And so, yeah. So I think as a filmmaker, and what I like to do is mostly documentary stuff, is partly about education and partly about informing people, but engaging people too. And I think, Rob, from the get-go, you said you want to have this debate that's educational, but it's informative for people, but it entertains people as well too. And I think you did a really good job with that. So.
I appreciate it. I was actually kind of nervous because I was running a bunch of things behind the scenes, and I think next time around, if we do it again, and I'd love to do it again, maybe we'll figure out a way where someone can run the different things in the background. I really wanted to include a lot of the comments from people in either YouTube or Facebook that I wanted to give the viewers a really unique and fun experience where they would see their own comments at the bottom of the screen. So we weren't able to do that. But now I'd like to bring on our co-moderator, Shana Castillo. Shana, welcome.
Hey, hi, how are you guys?
We're good. We're kind of debriefing and talking about our experience Saturday night, putting the debate together. That took a little bit under 3 weeks under the leadership of Jorge. But we can't forget about the other members of the committee. So, Jorge, if you'd like to give them all a shout out, because every single one of the members played a very unique and important part in putting this together. So we definitely want to give them give them a shout out. So if you want to go down the list of the guys.
Think I can do it pretty quick. And Rob, Shana, help me if, I might quickly miss someone. But I think this was really powered by people in the neighborhood. Just neighbors that I, knew were going to be active in the neighborhood. And, in addition to the people that we have on the screen right now, there were people like Rebecca Harshbarger, who, lives in Sunset Park, is a former New York Post reporter, former campaign manager at one point for campaign here in the district. She got involved. We have Carmen Maria Ray, who's a really talented immigration lawyer that is at Brooklyn Law School, and now she's actually at a new job and helped us really do some research for the questions. There was our friend Rodrigo Camarena, who is the board chair at Mixteca and very active person who's a new dad and really helped us get a really strong, good format together. We had folks like Cynthia Felix, who's a Department of Education administrator that has so much knowledge about state funding and like how Medicaid and education funding get done. And she was really, really instrumental in just helping to craft really good questions that I think you, Rob, and Shana did such an excellent job, I think, delivering. And then we had Antoinette Martinez, who is, a lifelong Sunset Park resident, has been really active most recently, I think, just on organizing around Industry City and on making sure people know what's happening on their waterfront. Like John was saying, there's so much going on there. It's difficult sometimes to just keep track of it all. And she's been really sharp on that and on the community board as well. And then who am I missing now? I think that's the core group that kind of stepped up. And then of course, we had extra partners like Center for Family Life and Chinese American Planning Council and Voces Ciudadanas and Academy for Medicine and Public Health Services. And, they're nonprofits, and this is a tough time for them. And they, they each did what they could, including help to get language services so it would be available in Spanish and Chinese. And I feel, that it took a big Sunset Park village to help get it all together. And I'm really happy everybody stepped up in the way that they did.
Yeah, it was definitely without a doubt a team effort. And so did it turn out how you envisioned it? Or I know on my end, there was a lot of things that I could improve on, especially with the technical stuff. And I'm really bummed I couldn't get the people's comments out onto the screen on time. And then trying to watch the Timekeepers, trying to keep up with the questions, paying attention to what when my co-moderator was speaking so that I can't come in on time. So a lot of things going on, but it was definitely a fun experience. But did it kind of play out the way you thought it would?
Yeah, I think it did. I don't know if you remember this, Rob, but there was a certain point, I think it was even 10 days before the debate when we didn't know if Felix was going to come. Mm-hmm. You were really nervous. you were telling me oh, Jorge, I don't think he's going to come. No way. He told me no. And there was a point I think that I felt a little nervous too about what would ultimately happen if everybody would show up. But I think, having 125 of our neighbors come together with interpretation, with good, smart questions that were asked, I think definitely is what I was expecting. And I think it even exceeded my expectations in some way because, there's just some things that, were quickly, I think, improvised towards the end as we were getting ready to actually do the debate. We got the questions really, really down. And Shana and Rob, you were kind of in the center of all that. Everyone was trying to feed you questions and as much information as possible. And you had Santor getting all the statistics from the 72nd precinct. And I'm curious how it felt for you both as co-moderators, like, just like having all that, like,
data information.
Yeah.
Well, Shana, tell us what was your experience like during the whole thing. You've moderated a debate before, a couple of debates before, I think, right?
Well, I wasn't the moderator, but helped to plan the last city council election debate. So it was actually the last debate before the election in that series. There may have been about 2 other debates that happened in Sunset Park. One in the off of like the 7th, 8th Avenue area. And one hosted by, I believe, Uprose, and then a third that was in Red Hook. So through Love Trumps Hate, Sunset Park, and with Misteka, we planned the last debate housed in Sunset Park. And so I was part of the planning committee, but I wasn't actually the moderator. So this was definitely a new experience for me. And just like you, Rob, I had the nerves, especially because you're doing it in your home. And so you're not with everyone as you are in person. You're with everyone virtually. So you still want to make sure that people can hear you. The visuals look good. Everything looks clear. And that there's still that people connection, even though we're all apart now, really because of COVID. And I think we used the technology well. I think Rob, you did absolutely excellent. It was a ton that you had to be in charge of and looking at the time. And I think it went really smoothly. I would say, though, that I feel like when you're in it, you're asking the questions, you're looking in at the live comments, you're looking in at the time, you're doing your best to listen to the answers to prepare your follow-up. But afterwards, I listened back and I really felt that the questions were just really good. And I really think that was like to the credit of the entire working group for really doing their research, looking at questions that were appropriate, that were not duplicative of the last forum, that were relevant and that were fact-based to provide for a fruitful discussion. And I think that really showed. I hope that the audience would agree to that. But in listening back to it, I was really proud of that approach that we all took and the quality of the questions.
The questions were definitely on point and very relevant. And, just off the top of my head, I think an important question that needed to be included. And I remember the night before the debate, everyone on the screen here, we were up till about 1:00 in the morning finalizing the questions, right? And, our current assembly member has been in office for a very long time. And there was some issues that had come up within the last year about some corruption charges of some staff members in his office. And, we talked about that the night before. Should this question be included, right? Because we want transparency, right, from the people that are supposed to represent us. And it was a question that applied to everyone, but you went in very specific and said, there are these charges that affect your office. Let's talk about it. And it wasn't a question where we were trying to corner him. That wasn't the idea. But if he wants to continue representing us, he has to answer, and he has to answer to the people, right? And he took it on and he answered it. So I commend you because that was a tough question, I think. And I think you delivered it very well. And but the people needed to know. And I'm proud of the team for putting that question, for having the guts to put it out there too.
Yeah. And Rob, let me just add to that. I feel, when this news first broke like last year, it was something that, like, obviously is like very shocking to a lot of people, because all of us, I think, on the screen knew Me Too, like we were familiar with him as a representative for Ortiz, and to see that kind of corruption happening at just like at the local level was very shocking to a lot of people. And I remember some of us went down to Felix Ortiz's district office, probably like the day after the news broke. And we just invited some people to say, some people from the neighborhood to ask him what's going on. Just what can you just like explain this to us? And, Jeremy, you actually were there at that point, but, the response that we got at that time was radio silence. And, to be very frank, our experience being there, like Felix Ortiz's office called the police on myself and Jeremy and a few other people to prevent us from asking questions. And so I remember that from last year. And, Mr. Ortiz finally had to answer, in a public way, what did happen with those $80,000. We elect Mr. Ortiz to be a budget negotiator for us in large part, right, in Albany, and keeping account of things like that is very relevant. So I was very happy that we brought it up in I think a very fair way, and I appreciated the question being put on the table, because at least for me personally, it is something that I know I have been trying to get some answers on for some time, and I think we heard, whether people take his answer or don't, he addressed it.
Yeah, and I honestly think it's actually pretty shocking that the whole issue hasn't really been talked about a lot in this election, and that I think it's a relevant thing to bring up. And I think our conversation about why to include that was really for the voter to have as much information as possible. And that I felt like for months there's been just sort of no discussion about it, and that was really sort of bizarre to me, that this was a federal case that had all this news, all this media coverage about a year ago, 9 months or so, and then all of a sudden it's not even brought up. And it got brought up barely, I think, just briefly in the Uprose debate by one of the opponents. But so it felt like journalistically it was really important for us to include that, because it is such a big topic. And also the issues around the Brooklyn Democratic Party and levels of like accountability and transparency. And so there's a lot of issues, and it's important because it's like, everyone is running to be the nominee for the Democratic Party and be a part of it. And I think it's important to have these conversations about how to make the party more accountable.
Yeah, and he definitely had to address it, and it was definitely a fair question. That was one of my favorite questions. I also like the questions about the police, right? This is a district that we've seen police brutality from our local precinct, and it's a pattern that is not new. Historically, it has happened many times in our district. And so those questions, I think, were very important. The final question, I thought, was also a very important question. And one of my favorite questions during the whole debate as well is, our community is 80% people of color and immigrants, right? What made the individual feel that they were the best person, or is the best person for this job? So those were all great questions that the team came up with. But in general, what were your thoughts about how the candidates did? I think, I'd like to hear about that if anyone wants to chime in.
I would say that I think that there are, a couple of different ways to structure a forum, and we knew that we wanted to structure one in which it was just based on the issues and their approach to tackling the issues, and less on their critiques with each other, which are certainly relevant. Like, it's certainly relevant to ask questions of a sitting assembly person for over 20 years and to push them in a way as to why, you're talking about what you would do now. Why didn't you do it before then? That's all really relevant. And there's space for that. And time for that if you set up the forum that way. But I think we were intentional where we wanted the forum although you think you have 2 hours, you think you can cover tons of ground, the time goes by really quickly. And there's so much that's so important in every election, particularly in local elections, where you really see the real impact on your life through the elected officials that are selected. So I think our approach on just really keeping it focused to the issues, not having rebuttals, not having lengthy opening or closing statements, I think actually play to all of the candidates' favor. I think that they all had enough time to get their points across, because you did the 190-second question and then you had an immediate 60-second follow-up. I did see on the live chat that there were discussion amongst the audience themselves, which I also think is really cool, because they can discuss amongst themselves and even kind of correct the record amongst themselves in a way. And I saw some of that going on, where some of the candidates liked that, or some of the audience members rather liked when a candidate attacked a bit on the record. So you saw that a lot of happening with Catherine against Felix, and then others actually rebutting and saying, well, we don't actually want to see that. We want to see more what your plan is. So I thought that was interesting to see that play out in the live comments.
Yeah, it's always interesting when one candidate challenges or says something about the incumbent. Some people like that because it is entertaining, right? Like you give them a zinger, and people like that. But then some people, based on the comments, get turned off by that. They're like, tell us instead what you're going to do, instead of just attacking this guy. Tell us what your plan is. I agree with you. I think the format was great. It kept things moving. There was none of that back and forth where they're attacking each other, and it was straightforward. And I think we did great on time. 2 hours, I think, is more than enough, where we don't lose viewers and they're not bored. And it kept things interesting and moving along. So I like that format a lot, and very different than other debates that we're used to seeing.
Yeah.
Could I interject just for a second in that? I think that it's also important to see when people challenge an established political figure. It's important to understand who the challengers are, the challengers are, and what the bases of their critiques are. And certainly, I think something that came out in both the Uprose debate and to an extent in our debate was Mr. Ortiz trying to argue that his record is either not understood or misunderstood or not appreciated. There are things that he has done that he is not getting credit for. And so I think it's part of the challenge of doing these is when you have an incumbent and they're being challenged by folks that haven't held office before, you really want to try to understand what the challengers are proposing as an alternative. Are they just making criticisms? Are they just advancing criticisms, or do they actually have viable alternative proposals? And that's, that happens a lot in politics. I think it's going to keep happening. High-profile people are getting primaried all over the place. It seems to be increasing as far as I can tell. There's more and more attention on primaries. Obviously, AOC won a huge one. There's another one. My hometown congressman, where I live in the Bronx, or I grew up in the Bronx, Elliot Engel is being primaried right now. So in those cases, if you're doing a forum, I think you really want to try to get the challengers to explain why they think they would be better. So I'm glad we had some of those questions in the forum as well, so that you're not just giving a chance for people to come in and criticize the incumbent, because I don't think that necessarily advances public understanding of what their options are.
Yeah, and in some cases it might help the incumbent, right? Because it gives an opportunity to answer some of the criticisms, I guess, and we saw some of that as well, where Felix was like, no, well, we did this, and when Catherine was saying, well, you've been there so long, why hasn't anything happened? And then Ortiz kind of relates that to, well, it was because we had Republicans in the House then, and I couldn't get anything done. Now we have majority Democrats, and we might be able to get some things done. But you were one of the timekeepers. Tell us a little bit about that. Was that something easy for you, or?
It was. I messed up the first time I was supposed to. The first round I was keeping time for, I messed up. I was supposed to give a 15-second warning when Hennessis was speaking, and I didn't do that. So I'm sorry, Hennessis. I talked for a couple seconds. But it was stressful. The time really goes by fast. I mean, we were giving people 90 seconds. It's interesting to watch. I actually felt like, because ours was the second debate, they had done the Uprose debate before. I felt like with the Uprose debate, everybody was constantly going over the time they were being given, and they were just being cut off. And then when they were doing ours, I feel like they had a clock in their head a little bit more finely tuned, and they were staying more often within those 90 seconds or within those 60 seconds. So that was interesting to see. But it wound up being, surprisingly stressful to keep time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I like this style because we weren't interrupting them with the 15-second warning. We were just letting them speak. We would give them a warning internally where they could see it on their screen where they were. And then at the end, if they went over, then we would say time. And we didn't really have to cut them off often. They did kind of keep track of themselves. And also, if you're giving them a warning, you're interrupting their train of thought. And then by the time they stop and then they go, they've already lost maybe 2-3 seconds. And that just kind of is distracting, I think. So in that case, I think ours kind of flowed differently. And I like that concept that we came up with to do that. Now, Jeremy, you were also monitoring the chat. What was that like?
I think what was interesting was I had a conversation with a couple people who were watching it, and they were actually watching it on the Facebook feed. And we were commenting on how different the Facebook feed was from the YouTube feed. I was looking at the YouTube feed, and it was actually a really great kind of civil conversation, people bringing in a lot of good questions and kind of following up and asking more questions because they saw that both you and Shana were like constantly like taking questions. So people, I think, were really encouraged to actually offer more questions. But then I heard that, and so I didn't see the Facebook feed until later. And then noticing that I heard from a lot of people that the Facebook feed had sort of more of the like interpersonal politics. And
that's interesting.
And so that was kind of fascinating. So that it turned out that the YouTube one was very like people there was a little bit of like some, sniping at a specific candidate. And a couple people were like, no, let's not do that. Like, let's ask questions. So that was really nice to see that the community was sort of like, let's make this like a productive space for questions and comments and stuff. And there wasn't a lot of just like, yeah, I love my candidate or this candidate stinks. And so, so it's kind of fascinating to see that we had kind of two sides of that. And I don't know why the Facebook feed was the way that it was versus the YouTube feed.
Yeah, so I guess Facebook was a little rowdier.
Yeah. Maybe some people thought it was more entertaining, but
yeah. No, and it is entertaining. Just in general, I guess a lot of the back and forth about politics that takes place on Facebook is always kind of entertaining. One thing that we were talking about the day before in the evening, when we were up late till like 1 o'clock coming up with the questions, was a post from our council member where he endorsed Catherine Walsh, and there was people on Facebook who had a problem with that, and then that kind of got out of control, and as we were playing with that, we kind of came up with the question about representation. And I think that it helps, right? It helps if people get a little rowdy in there, and then that kind of prompted us to come up with that question. But it is interesting that it does get
sorry, I got cut off for a little bit. Rob, did we already talk about the Facebook?
No, that's exactly what we're talking about right now.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was in charge of looking at the Facebook feed, and It got pretty rowdy in there, I would say. People, we had Felix Ortiz's son, right? Jumping in, like providing live commentary, sometimes breaking news that I hadn't even heard of. For example, I think many of us probably know there's like a controversy right now on the person that Felix Ortiz has endorsed for district leader. Robert Berrios, there's a Gothamist article about him apparently, sharing pictures of youth organizers with the NYPD. And, I think Katie Walsh at one point in the debate attacked Felix for that endorsement and for supporting that person. And you saw Felix Ortiz's his son respond in real time saying, "Hey, you're lying, Katie. Like, that's my dad just rescinded the endorsement. You're misleading the people." So you saw really intense live commentary in a very personal way from Felix's family. And people I also think were very real in the Facebook chat. One woman I remember was sharing just an experience she had with one of the candidates, Marcella, earlier in the day, saying she had bumped into her, wasn't happy with the experience, and she shared some stuff on that. And I think that kind of stuff only happens in live events like this. So
yeah, and Jeremy,
I think I was just going to say, I think that some of the commentary, again, it's like, it could be your individual opinion, right? Like the woman in the park, for example, that Jorge just referenced. But sometimes you're really like a representative of the campaign. And we saw that play out on accusations on Facebook. And we saw it a bit in the live comments on Saturday. And that really can become a problem for a particular campaign. It's really up for the person running for that position and their leadership to really set the stage and how they would prefer for people to behave and to communicate when defending their position and their record and why they're the best person for the job. At the end of the day, I wouldn't, blame the campaign. Everyone's an individual. They're all adults. But I think with some of the commentary, at least on the stream on Saturday, it didn't really do your candidate a big favor. And so I'd be curious to see if any candidates caught some of that, and if they're, had some conversation with people about thanks for having my back, but let's do it a different way next time.
Yeah, definitely. Super important. Great point. And continuing the conversation about Facebook, Jorge, when you jumped back on, we were talking about Carlos Menchaca's endorsement of Catherine, and how that also stirred up a huge thread of comments on both sides of both sides there. Some people having a problem with him endorsing Catherine, and so that's a perfect example of what goes on Facebook. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that particular post.
I can say just that I think it's a fascinating question of who gets to represent a neighborhood and who gets to sort of claim the mantle of authenticity when representing a neighborhood. And that was sort of I think part of the heart of that conversation. And also, as we're in a moment where so many things are being reevaluated and challenged regarding gender norms and the racial makeup of power structures in our society, it's a very relevant question. I think that the conversation can go in a less than constructive direction sometimes, but if you're having it in a constructive way, it's a fascinating question to think who gets the neighborhood enough, who understands the people intuitively enough to really advocate for them and to fight for them. And does that person have to be of a certain gender or a certain ethnicity? Do they have to have been active in the community for a certain period of time? I think this comes up a lot, but it's fascinating to see it in a very local context like this, and it's a really legitimate issue. I don't know what the right answer is. I think it's sort of a case by case basis, but it's certainly relevant to this race.
And I want to add something too, which is, as I saw this controversy play out of Carlos Menchaca's endorsement for Katie Walsh, one thing that kind of struck me was the people that were most upset were, I think, people that all of us would recognize as people that, in 2017 were like the biggest, most diehard Menchaca supporters. People that have been by his side for both of his elections, his election and then his re-election campaign. And to see, just a little bit, a political elected official have, I guess, his base turn on him, because I think, whatever people might see in that thread, I think one thing that's very clear, I think Councilmember Menchaca's position is not a popular one among the people that have supported his campaigns in the past. Seems like it's one that's proving very, very controversial, and reminds me a little bit of the moment kind of like that the mayor is in, right? Like Carlos, they're term limited. They can't run for anything else. Facing a lot of criticism sometimes for some of their decisions. And, in both cases, I think having a lot of supporters of theirs really say, you're making a decision, but it's not one that really resonates with their base. So I don't know. That's one thing that I kind of noticed as I was reading through the comments.
I think also too, what caught people off guard in some way was that I think a lot of people were assuming that Carlos would stay out of this race, and that the endorsement was so late, and that it was clearly time to try to be strategic about it, to have it sort of right before the first Uprose debate, and that, Katie Walsh now has flyers and everything printed up with his endorsement on it. So it didn't really seem like this is something that was, it was sort of managed or orchestrated in some way to have some of that's prepped, or they worked really quickly to have the flyers done. But I think in a lot of ways it took people by surprise that the endorsement happened when it did, and I think also it goes back to sort of the sense of like who people felt Carlos represented and worked for, and that he's the chair of the immigration, and that he's always been talking about his focus a lot of times is on undocumented people and the communities that he feels like are the most vulnerable. And so I think for the people who are upset about it, it felt like here you have two candidates who come from those communities or represent those communities that Carlos says, I stand with these communities, I work with them, I work for them, and being like, why, maybe you don't have to back anybody, but why do something that feels like a rejection of them? And I think I think it's a really tricky thing, because I don't think Carlos really gave a good answer for really, and especially given the fact that you look at what he said about why he was endorsing Katie, and to me those same things apply to Marcela and Genesis, and the sort of policy issues. And so it felt a little disingenuous to be like, I back Katie Walsh because she's about budget justice, when, if you look at both Genesis and Marcela's platforms, that's clearly what they're talking about. And like from our debate too, you see as well that where people are standing on the issues. And, it's interesting to have Carlos sort of say,
Jeremy,
I back her for these reasons.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
One of our neighbors, Elisabeth Pierre, executive director of Uprose, she put like a theory on the table in that comment thread that she felt that Councilmember Menchaca was taking vengeance on certain candidates because, well, Genesis Aquino and Marcela Matines have done protests outside of the council member's office. And so she mentioned that and she put that in that thread. I'm just curious what you think about like comments like that.
I mean, I think that definitely played a part. It's hard not to see how, especially because I feel like Carlos ended up sort of mentioning organizations that had been against the industry city rezoning in sort of elaborating on his rebuttal. But yeah, so I think that is unfortunate because, and then Elisabeth followed up with it by saying, every elected official gets criticized. And you need to understand that that's part of the job. And so to, I think, maybe I don't know if that played the biggest role, but I think it did seem like it played some role in it. That and we also have to say too that both Genesis and Marcela were also at times supporting Carlos on various different issues along the way, like on Ice Watch stuff, on housing rights and tenant issues and stuff. Like Carlos has shown up for those things. So it's not just that they've purely criticized him, but it does feel like in some way or another, because the industry city rezoning was such a major issue for Carlos, and another way in which I think he was blindsided by the reaction to his decisions, really from the speech that he gave on September 15th, like, I don't think he anticipated the reaction at all from people, and quite frankly, I think didn't understand like a lot of people's anger about the situation. And so I think this is kind of a duplication of that moment where I think Carlos sort of misjudged or didn't read, his base or his constituents, and didn't really understand, or I think take a proper temperature check of where people were at.
Yeah, it's
I think this is I was just going to say, Rob, I think this is just a reminder of how personal politics is, right? And when someone decides to spend their very limited free time and, volunteer day in, day out, weekend in, weekend out for a candidate, they are really incredibly invested, and they build that personal bond. And I think for some of the commentary, we saw that there seemed to be like a very genuine sense of betrayal from the individuals. You can decide whether, that's the way that they feel. And Carlos said in his statement that, he's, I don't recall the exact words, but basically that he's going to make his own decision. And I think that's like the interesting dynamic there is like, one, when you build up a coalition of people, you then are really incredibly responsible for the decisions that you make. And it's like this extra layer of just, yes, I'm responsible for the decisions that I make to the constituents that I serve. But then there's this other extra layer of like these people who have really supported me in genuine ways, right? Because we're not talking about like lobbyists, right? These are not people that are supporting you or courting you for their own gain. That's going to be more power, more money. These are just everyday residents that are supporting you. But you do have this extra layer of accountability there, right? And people that are genuinely going to feel hurt by a decision that they just didn't foresee happening. And I think that's just something that's important. I think, and that's all about representation, right? That's what we're talking about, is like the importance in many of those individuals' eyes is really having candidates that are, in their opinion, equally as qualified, very, very similar policy, maybe even better ideas, but really represent the majority of the demographics in the community. I think the other piece of it, though, is just like the power, right? Like it takes communities of color a tremendous amount of time to build up this sort of influence and power. And that's what Sunset Park, that's what, the council district has had is whether if it was effective or not, you had people of color that were able to have a seat at the table. And so I think that's another thing which, should really be risen up, is this idea of like, well, now did you remove the seat at the table that it's taken so long to build up, and put it in the hands of someone who may say that they will represent us well, but just doesn't have the same lived experience that we have. And I think that that's like an interesting thing to just ponder.
Definitely. And so is it safe to say then that maybe someone who is white cannot represent this district effectively? Because I think that's part of the big controversy, if not the reason why his endorsement is so controversial, because she's a white woman in a district that is 80% not white. Can a white person represent the district effectively? Is that part of the issue here, that people feel that how does this woman know my experience, although she was born and raised in Sunset Park, right? Like,
right.
What are your thoughts on that? And anyone?
I don't know if I think there certainly was a critique around having the same lived experience. So obviously she's born and raised Sunset Park resident, so she has that experience, which even Carlos doesn't have, right? He wasn't born and raised here. And he certainly has received a lot of criticism over the years for just, apparently sweeping in and claiming his spot. So I don't know if the question is really just like around her qualifications to represent the district well. I felt like a criticism, and again, it felt very personal for people who have very marginalized experience, in their lived experience, was why not do something that actually begins to deconstruct this system that has been in place for so many years around who gets a seat at the table? Why not take a stand toward that in a direction that, those commentators, again, we'll see what comes across on election day, but at least those commentators felt was deserving of a woman of color candidate, immigrant candidate. Why, if you had to say something, so one option is, again, not to endorse. I think he said in his post that no one else asked for his endorsement. I think that's what I read there. And the endorsement came late. But if you just made the decision to step in, like, why step in a way that just goes in favor of this structure that has been in place for far too long, where it is increasingly so hard for someone of color to get a seat at the table? I think it's more about that versus could you do a quality job? But what do you guys think?
I think also too the question revolves around not just the racial component, but also the class component too, and the backgrounds that everybody has, and sort of that was kind of one of the points that I have too, is that the structural inequality also comes with the fact that that Katie in the race had more money than actually Felix had the most money mainly, but of the challengers, that Katie Walsh had the most, even though actually her donations, she had less donations than Marcella did. And but it was just a matter of basically having much larger donations. And so I do think that the question of, is it possible for somebody with their background to represent? Like, yes, it is possible, but is it necessarily the right thing to do? And does it make you the best candidate when there are other candidates who have lived experiences that are very rich, they're grassroots organizers, and they're in that race? It just makes it really difficult to say, yes, this is a very progressive move to run in this race, and so it's like, she's running, that's fine. I think the voters need to consider how necessary it is to say, we have two other candidates. They have these lived experiences. It's important to value those lived experiences and their backgrounds.
But could I ask, what about? I mean, can't Felix make the argument that, he came to the United States from Puerto Rico? He's been here for so long. Surely he's the one who understands what people need and what people experience. I mean, would he be part of that conversation? Does that conversation have to be? It just seems to me like that argument it could also apply to him as well.
I think it does apply to him, and I think that's what he was saying in his answer to that last question on representation. All of this, there are three women who are not satisfied with the representation that Felix has provided throughout, two decades, and they're all vying to unseat him. And it begs the question as to what conversations happened before decisions were made as to who runs against him and why they decide to do that. And I think that's why you see even maybe more sense of disappointment or an urgency to respond to the council members' endorsement, because for those that are looking for a new elected official, this is a very competitive, tight race. And you have three alternates that may just split the vote, right? And so for people who care about that, then, and I'm sure there's a lot of inside baseball that could be shared around things that happened or that they wanted to have happened to make a decision as to whether this should have been a race of just two people, the incumbent and a new challenger, versus four people.
Yeah, and I always wondered, I believe they all belong to the same political club. Couldn't they have maybe talked this over early on and maybe pick one of the three to challenge the incumbent? Because like Shana said, this definitely divides the vote. I think having many alternatives, only helps the incumbent. Is that right? What do you guys think?
Yeah, especially without ranked choice voting. I mean, I think if there was ranked choice voting, then it might not hurt as much, but because it's basically you only pick one candidate, it's definitely going to hurt the challengers for sure.
Here's my feeling about it. I'm mixed, because on the one hand, club politics, political club politics is all about doing what you said, Ron, which is in a small room with maybe 30, 40 of your friends. You try to figure this out all in advance and negotiate behind closed doors, who's staying out this round, who's going to jump in, who's going to do someone else a favor 2 years from now. And that's what political machine politics is. That's what Carlos Menchaca is a part of. That's what is so corrupt, honestly, about a lot of the Democratic Party, is that it's private, small rooms at the back of bars, in the back of a restaurant. That's how it's done. And there was a part of me that is almost glad that wow, you know what? Nobody, this is a really free choice that people will have to make. It's not decided for them. I think it does give a lot of advantage to Felix Ortiz. It's just a reality. But, if any of the challengers were to succeed, I think they will be that much stronger for it, because of how competitive they would have had to fight for it. So,
and all of the candidates also clearly view themselves as being very different. They have different personal experiences. They have different backgrounds, different personal and professional backgrounds. They're different ages. They have chosen to focus on different issues. So, I think obviously they all think they're the best choice. So I don't think in this case there was going to be any sort of, people coming together and deciding to step aside for each other's benefit. And that's happened around the country. I mean, like, I think it was Rashida Tlaib, who was one of the big races in 2018 to Congress. I think she had something like a 6 or a 7-way primary that she won.
Yeah.
So, this happens when you have a whole bunch of people who decide I'm the best person. I think it's refreshing to have a lot of choices. Oftentimes in these races, you don't have any choices. And when you do have choice, it forces everybody to make the case for themselves.
Let me put just another question on the table. There is this YouTube comment just now about gender and about, a field of 3 women, 1 male. I forget who the YouTube commenter was, but they said something about how that might be like a factor in the race. I mean, Felix has used sometimes some dismissive language against like some of the challengers. I think a lot of us probably remember in the first debate, he said that he felt that his opponents had their knee on his neck. I think, that's, pretty charged, racially charged language to be using in the middle of the George Floyd protests.
Do you think that was a gaffe, or you think that was just something planned?
I think he really feels it. I really feel he feels personally attacked. Felix Ortiz, just before we came on live, actually commented on our debate on Facebook. And, I sent this around to the group, but, basically what he says there, you can probably read it on screen. Mm-hmm. I'll just read it. Yeah. He said, my grandmother used to tell me not to respond to people who lie about me or mock my success in order to make themselves look better. I listened. My experience and leadership will move our community forward as we move to rebuild our lives and our businesses. So, Felix, from reading this comment and just from hearing, his comments from the last debate, does seem to feel attacked in some way, like perhaps unfairly, but, I don't know. I just was thinking a little bit about that YouTube comment and about whether, I don't know if there's a gender dynamic at play here. I might not be the best for it.
Yeah, that's also why I think it was so important, why I don't think anybody said, look, let's have these candidates, someone needs to drop out, because it's so important to have women run. And, it's not the place of people to be like, everyone's been saying we need more women in office. And yeah, and then just go back to, I think, Felix's comment. I think it's interesting that, again, it's the way in which politics becomes personal, and how also, Felix is a very savvy politician. You got to credit him to that during the debate, that was kind of his tactic of like diffusing a situation, was bringing in this personal side of things and bringing in referencing his grandmother and like, talking about that as if it was like an insult to his, relatives and to who he was, and kind of using it as like a shield, to protect him. When it's like, in a lot of ways, like as a 26-year incumbent, like, yes, you are going to be challenged on your record, as you should be, as, every politician should be. And it's interesting because there's so many years of not being challenged. So maybe now it feels like this is very tough. But, I think it's important for the, community members from Sunset Park and Red Hook to get tough questions answered and to be able to say, is Felix Ortiz doing enough? Can we do better? And like, do I understand his record well enough? And how explain his record in his own words. And so, yeah, I think that's, just part of politics. And I think the point of the debate was to really get these issues out there and have everybody be able to judge on their own. Do I think Felix is doing a good job? Does he, deserve to continue to do the job?
Yeah, one of the things that I wish we asked or should have included is their thoughts on term limits. I mean, here he's been there for 26 years, right? Should there be term limits? I don't know. I don't know what they would have responded to that. But do you guys think there should be term limits? I think 26 years is a long time?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a great question. And it would be interesting to hear their responses. I think that it definitely makes a lot of sense in every elected title to have term limits. Like, why wouldn't you? It's a good thing. And I think that, and some of that is because you don't want someone to get too comfortable and to have too many, where then, the work doesn't really flow at the same sense of urgency. But another really important reason is because you want new ideas, and that can come from different lived experiences. It can come, from just being of a different generation. But ideas have to evolve in the same sense of urgency as our issues change. They have to evolve. And that can be really hard to do if you're doing the same job for too long of a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've heard some people who support Felix say, well, their argument is that, well, he's been there a long time. He's got some sort of clout now. He has pull there now. Or he's assistant speaker, and that's got to have some sort of weight to get the things the district needs. But I agree with what Shana said about you get too comfortable. And if you're comfortable, then maybe you're not necessarily doing the things that the district needs. So that's why I think it gets tricky. And maybe there should be term limits. Maybe instead of 2 years, they should do 4 years with two terms, and then be done with, so that we get fresh people going there.
I think the flip side is the idea that people gain experience. I mean, not only do they gain power within political parties, but they gain experience, they gain knowledge, and then they can therefore do the job more effectively. I'm obviously studiously not taking a position, but I do think there are some legitimate arguments. And if you feel as though an incumbent has been in office for a certain period of time that they're too comfortable, I mean, part of my question would be how much public engagement is that person getting, or is the public effectively pushing that person to stay current with their beliefs and to stay flexible with what they're advocating for as issues change, because there is a responsibility on the public to do that as well, not just, I think, on the elected official to be replaced periodically. But this is a national issue. I mean, just a couple of years ago, again, at the congressional level, there were people running against Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House,
and now too.
Yeah, correct. The argument is she's too old. She's been there for too long. She no longer represents where the party is going. So and then a lot of people defended her and said that, well, no, she's the most experienced person. She's the most effective in this position. She's done a great job building coalitions, and she should stay in the position. So you get arguments on both sides.
Yeah. John, I'm going to weigh in on this, and my instinct at first is it would be to term limits, of course, sound like a good thing. But you know what? Now that I think about it a little bit more, there are people like Nydia Velázquez, for example, right, who has served just as long as, for example, Assemblymember Ortiz, and arguably, appreciably, I don't know, I'll say it, I feel a very different kind of representation from Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez than I do with Assemblymember Ortiz. I feel like a higher quality level of representation. And I think if somebody is able to prove their record, you know what? Maybe it's not really so much term limits. Maybe it's just I feel like it's more like, do we have a good democracy around the candidates and the people, so that we choose good people. I mean, Felix Ortiz has only been challenged really 2014 and this time in 26 years. I don't know. Something is wrong in just the way that has happened, that there has not, something in our political process has not been able to encourage challengers. And, I don't know quite what that is. Increasingly, like, to be very frank, I'm becoming more and more a little bit disillusioned with the Brooklyn Democratic Party and like what it's been doing, and whether the Democratic Party really is going to be able to bring the kind of change that I think a lot of people, especially today, are calling for. But I do think what's happening this year, 2020, has really never happened before in 26 years in Sunset Park, that like 4 people decided, you know what, this office of state assembly to go and negotiate the budget with Governor Cuomo and like figure out the state laws because they're important. Like, people really have not cared about it for that long, and it does bring me a lot of, it brings me a lot of joy, I think, to see and see as many people paying attention to it as they are now, which hasn't, for whatever reason, happened. And I grew up in Brooklyn, but I'm not like a lifelong Sunset Park resident. I've really only been here since 2013. But it does interest me, like, how that's happened.
One of the things that worries me is the voter turnout because of the pandemic, which is a shame, because we have a really important race. We have an incumbent for 26 years and 3 challengers. And I think that voter turnout is going to be a big issue that's going to affect this election.
Yeah, I agree.
What do you guys think?
I agree. I think that's the one thing we can predict, is that it's going to be lower than it should be.
Yeah.
With, that's you can predict, because that's the way it's been, and that's really unfortunate. I think that the pandemic, of course, certainly affects that. And I think without the pandemic, we would have, and hopefully everybody goes out and votes tomorrow, or if you still have your paper ballot that was mailed to you, you put it in the mailbox tomorrow morning and you cast your vote, because it is extremely important. So I think that we were on track to see those numbers increase, because you had this interesting competitive race. But generally, just not enough people go out there to vote. And I think that's like another reason why I think that term limits, even for the politicians that are very popular and serving their district year after year, at a certain time, I think that those just help, because you want to just spur more democracy and getting more people involved in the process. And people are too busy and they have too many stresses in their lives. And if they know it's going to be hard for a new person to win against someone who's just got name recognition, then they might decide to stick a race out, to stay out and not cast their vote. And especially if they're seeing ballots where there aren't any challengers, then, some people may feel like, why bother to do it? I think that's unfortunate. And that's got to start from early. It's got to start from public school education and what we're teaching in there, and civics and debate club and all of that. And then it's got to continue into adulthood. But, typically that's when people get very jaded in the whole process. And so they sometimes decide to just, sit down and not participate in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've come to the fun part of the podcast this evening. And I'm not going to ask you who you're rooting for. I think you guys can definitely keep that private and neutral, because, we worked on this debate. We're on the podcast, and here in the podcast in general, my goal is always to keep things very neutral and give everyone a fair chance to state and express where they stand, right? But the $1 million question is, do you guys now listen carefully, right? Not who you would like to win, but do you have a prediction of what you think the outcome might be? Does anyone want to go out on a limb and talk about what they think, or say what they think might happen tomorrow? Anyone?
It's a tough question. Yeah. I mean, especially with the idea of a low voter turnout, and who's going to vote and who's voting absentee, and whether, people will turn out tomorrow if people aren't worried about, COVID. And and quite frankly, if there's a low turnout, then there's less concern about, you know, any issues with it. But I do think in a lot of ways, and just seeing this on the ground, and seeing sort of what's been going on with grassroots donations and things like that. Like in the last 2 filings, Marcella had 5 times as many donations as Katie Walsh did. That I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for Marcella. I think her campaign has been run well, and she's got a lot of people knocking doors. So, and you know, hanging up flyers and stuff. So to me, that helps sway in an election like this, where it's like, if it's going to come down to maybe hundreds of votes, who's hearing most, who's getting the most flyers. But again, at the same time, you never know. It's like, you know, Felix Ortiz has such name recognition, and he's got, you know, people who have known him for 26 years. So it's going to be a close one for sure.
Yeah, there's people that only know Felix Ortiz, and you know, some people think Felix Ortiz is the council member, and they just, you know, it's that name recognition, that brand, that will make things very tough. I'm wondering if anyone else on the panel has prediction.
Something in my gut, I don't know. Like, this has been, you know, I've been watching the voter turnout since 2016 and 2018, like, and in Sunset Park and in Red Hook, you know, in 2017 and 2018, voter turnout has increasingly gone up and up and up and up in Sunset Park. I think, you know, 2018 had 4 times like the regular turnout that would have ever happened in New York State. And I think, you know, there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical that people will turn out, but I do think that, you know, also just from like Jeremy, like just seeing people in the street, just seeing like the energy that they have, like the kind of just urgency I think that you feel in the air. I think people know that voting is important. You know, they might not, you know, they might be very frustrated by the process. They might be like mad at it. They might be very like annoyed at how very bizarre New York State has moved all these deadlines around over and over this year, you know, to like include a presidential primary and then take it away and then put it back on, right? Like, but I think people will come out and vote. For me, when I think about what might happen on election day, like my only prediction is I think that there will be more people voting this time than in 2018. And I think that Marcella has a lot of grassroots energy, but you know, it's tough when the progressive vote is divided or the challenging vote is divided. So, you know, although this isn't, I don't think my preferred outcome, you know, I do think Felix Ortiz is coming into election day with a big advantage. And miraculous things happen all the time in politics. Trump, you know, got elected president.
Well, I wouldn't want to call Trump a miracle, but yeah, I agree with you.
Election day with a big advantage.
Yeah, yeah. John, you have an insight?
Nothing other than just, you know, I expect the vote to be split, so I wouldn't be surprised if everybody just has a plurality, you know, for everybody's less than 50%. I feel like I would be surprised if anybody gets more than 50%. And obviously, you know, incumbency is hard to beat, but anything is possible. I don't have any insights other than that. So I'm expecting everybody to get somewhere between, you know, basically between 20 and 40%. I don't know if that math makes sense, but you know, the general range.
Right.
I would also be really interested to see, just in the realm of baseless speculation, if Mr. Ortiz wins the primary, would anybody run against him anyway as an independent, or just, you know, on their own? Would they, you know, would there be, you know, if he wins the primary but gets less than 50%, such that the combined weight of his 3 opponents was more than 50%, would there be conversation among the three challengers, and would they say, okay, one of us will go forward and we'll try to consolidate that vote? I don't know, but I would like to. We didn't get a chance to ask that. Although that was the first question asked of Donald Trump during the first Republican debate back in 2015, I think, was, if you don't win, will you endorse the Republican? So I don't know why I think of that, but that was the very first question they asked him. They were thinking about it, or would he do some sort of, independent run? So I would like to see what happens in that front. But I expect the candidates to speak to that after tomorrow. I think we'll get an answer to that question pretty quickly.
Well, sorry. I was going to say the one thing is we might not get an answer to the results for maybe a couple weeks. So that's going to leave a lot of things hanging up in the air. It's like that suspense of basically we might be counting absentee ballots, or maybe it's a close enough race that, like Hennessy's race in 2018 was only 100 votes. And really took, I want to say, 2 weeks before they sort of certified it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Prediction?
I was gonna say, that I think it's quite possible that we don't have an answer come tomorrow night. I think that I can honestly say that I have no idea. I can honestly say that because I just don't know. I think that. I think out of the four candidates, there are some that have built, bigger coalitions than others, right? So Jeremy's raised Marcella's coalition, Grassroots coalition. It's been really impressive. But, Felix also has his coalition, right? It's his brand and his name recognition. And then you have someone like Catherine, who is very new to the scenes, so to speak, but she definitely has support there. And then you have Hennessy's, which I think, hasn't been able to build as much of the financial support or the coalition support, but she's well respected and has worked in a number of areas. She probably is one of the most diverse candidates, right, in terms of her professional experience and her volunteer and organizing experience in the different areas that she's worked in. So I really don't know. What I'm most curious to see is obviously who is going to win the primary, because this is incredibly important. And I hope that people saw from the questions and the answers at the Uprose debate and at the Saturday debate that we held that this seat really impacts so much. It does impact the NYPD and what happens there. It does impact DOE and school funding. It incredibly has a huge impact on housing and its affordability, right? It's just so incredibly impactful. So I'm curious to see, after we know the answer, what happens to everybody else, right? Like I really want to see that, like which people fade away, which people continue to do work in the community, and does anyone then put their name in for the city council race?
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting. Those that fade away, if they do, then we know that maybe they were in it just to get in a position in politics. But I predict that, just thinking off the top of my head from what you just said, there's definitely at least a pair of candidates that whether they win or lose, we'll continue to see them do work in the community. Definitely, because I can tell that their love, their interest, they care for the community, and that care is sincere. So I definitely know that a few of the candidates will definitely stick around it. And I think win or lose, everyone ran a great campaign. I think it motivated people even during a pandemic. So I do hope that like Jorge said before, that people do come out and vote regardless of this pandemic, and that uptick that we see in voter turnout in this district continues to do that, to go up. Any last thoughts before we sign off that you'd like to share?
I had one final thought, but I don't want to, if anybody else wants to go first, I'll just very quickly, I would note that I think, to my knowledge, the only 2 debate forums for this race were done by Uprose, with the help of Brian Vines from Brick, and the one that we did. So you don't need a media organization officially to host a debate, especially in today's media climate. Local politics coverage is often sparse, or it's periodic, it's not consistent. So if you want to hear from your candidates in a race, just organize your own forum, organize your own debate. Don't wait for somebody to do it for you, because a lot of the time, nobody will step up to do it for you. So just do it yourself. And we put this together really in about 4 or 5 weeks. We were lucky that somebody like Rob was there on with all of his experience, and somebody like Shana was there, but we were able to put it together pretty efficiently, and Uprose did its own forum. So I would just encourage everybody to do the same anytime you want to hear from candidates, and hopefully this can continue. Hopefully we'll continue hearing from these candidates, whoever wins the race, on a regular basis.
I definitely agree. Well, I am very proud to have worked with every single one of you guys. It was a really fun experience. Hopefully it's not the last time that we collaborate. And you guys are always welcome on the podcast whenever there's anything that you want to talk about, that you want to share with the community. This podcast is your home. And I hope that we all get to work together again sometime.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yep,
Awesome.
same here.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for having us on.
Thank you guys. Have a great night.
All
Have a
right,
good
go
night, everyone.
vote if you haven't voted.
Vote yes.
All right, good night.
Exactly.